Okay, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this program at the Balie or wherever you are online, hopefully safe in your bubble at home or at work. Welcome to this special program on the US elections with a great guest. He's sitting there. Welcome, Ivo Daalder. Please give a round of applause for Ivo. Ivo and I know each other for quite some time, so I'm privileged to say Ivo. Ivo is with us today to discuss US elections and to give us some diplomatic fortune-telling. For the people who are not entirely up to date with his career, let me summarize the highlights of his career. He wrote 10 books on foreign policy. He has been the European Director in the National Security Council under President Clinton, a NATO ambassador under President Obama, and now he is the President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. That's quite a lot, but a very talented person, but his main talent is he is Dutch, partly. Ivo?
If they give me my passport back, maybe I would be, but right now I am just an American.
Okay. Do you have something, one sentence for our audience, mainly Dutch, in Dutch, Ivo?
Nou, het is geweldig om even terug te zijn in Amsterdam, terwijl ik dat toch even uit mijn woonkamer in Chicago doe. De technologie is toch zo dat we dat kunnen doen. Okay. Bedankt voor de uitnodiging. Graag hier. Ik kijk uit naar ons gesprek.
Okay. Friends and colleagues, we have a lot of ground to cover in only 1 hour, from China to Russia and from Europe to the Netherlands. We have no introductions, only questions. I hope a lot of questions from you, and I invite you to join us in the debate. But let's start in the United States, Ivo. The United States is on the brink of reaching 200,000 corona deaths and nearly 7 million COVID cases. There's a lot of political and domestic turbulence. What is the mood of the nation?
The mood of the nation is deeply polarized. I think it's the only way to describe it. There are two Americas right now. There is an America that is fearful that we are at the brink of a true destruction of everything that people care for, a health crisis that is seen as having been completely mismanaged, including the numbers proven by the numbers that you mentioned, an economic crisis that is affecting large numbers of people who don't own stock, which is the vast majority of people, a democracy crisis that is about the sanctity of the rule of law and where the country is going when it comes to voting and the counting of the votes and which votes will be counted. A worry about climate that is large and growing, not just in places where fires are burning at a rate that we have never seen. Just one statistic. 5 of the largest 10 fires in California history were burning in California last month. 5 of the largest 10. So these crises are leading a group of people to think that we are at the very point of almost no return. There is a second group that actually discounts or does not see the crises in the same way, that thinks that the numbers on COVID are exaggerated, that the economy was doing fantastic until COVID and it will come back very quickly. And the stock market is a measure of showing that, but just generally economic numbers are showing that our democracy is healthy, and to the extent it's not healthy, it's being rigged by people who want to deny the rightful winners of elections their seats, and who think that climate change is either something we will just have to live with or really not that important. They happen to fall in two camps politically, Democrats versus Republicans. We'll talk later about foreign policy and the differences that they have on foreign policy, which are equally striking. But clearly, we have a very divided nation. And the reality is that normally elections settle these things. I fear that this election is not going to settle this. We will be equally divided after the election as before.
So what is your mood then, personally? Because this sounds very somber.
Well, it depends on which side of the equation you are on. I do think we are facing 5 major crises, which is unprecedented in their combination and in their severity. A health crisis, which is as big and large as nothing we've seen since the Spanish flu in 1919. A economic crisis that is as deep as the Depression in the 1930s, a racial and identity crisis that is as deep as in the 1960s, a democracy crisis that is unique, at least going back to the 1860s in the United States, and a climate crisis that is truly unprecedented and unique. And it's the combination of those crises that are driving our politics in a very different way. And the question is, are we able to come together as a nation in the United States? And then importantly, is the United States as a nation able to bring together the group of nations it did bring together for 75 years to create what up to this point was historically the most prosperous, the most advanced, the most open and democratic world order that we have ever seen. So on the international scene, we're also at a point of where do we go from here?
Yeah, and last week your own Chicago Council published an interesting survey which showed that the Americans are divided on that world order, how they look at the world, and they are divided on foreign policy. Can you tell us something about the most important conclusions of that survey?
So there are 2 really important conclusions, because one is very positive and one is, and since we only talked about negative things, let me start off with the positive thing, and one is concerning. The positive thing is that overall, Americans still believe that it is important for the United States to remain engaged in world affairs. And you would have thought that with a global health crisis that has come to the United States from abroad, that there might have been a much more inclination on the part of Americans to retreat from the world as a defensive mechanism. And that is not the case. So in a question that we have been asking since 1974, that Gallup has been asking since 1947, do you think it is better for the future of the United States to remain engaged in world affairs, to take an active role in world affairs, or to stay out? 68%, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, 68% of Americans say it's better to have an active role in world affairs. That's about as high as it's ever been that we've ever asked. It's been 70, 71%, but it's right up there. Secondly, when it comes to the 2 mainstays of American foreign policy, alliances and trade, strong support for alliances across the board, alliances with Europe, alliances with our Asian partners, alliances in the Middle East. 2/3 of Americans think that they benefit the United States and its allies either equally or the United States more than its allies. And also very strong support for trade. I believe that trade helps U.S. relations with other countries, that it helps consumers like them, and we're talking about 75 to 80% of Americans believing that trade is a good thing. So that's the good news in the survey. There is a basic still belief in the American public that being actively engaged in the world, the kind of active engagement that the U.S. has pursued for the past 75 years, that led to the end of World War II, that led to the creation of the United Nations, which we're celebrating today, that led to the kind of order that we have seen in Europe and around the world, is a good thing, and that the U.S. should be part of that. Where there is concern is that the way Americans want to engage in the world, and the reason for engaging is starkly diverging between Republicans and Democrats. And perhaps the most stark finding is when we look at what Republicans and Democrats see as the most critical threats to the United States. There is no agreement on the top 5. The top 5 that Democrats point out as critical threats, are not included in the top 5, not one of them, in Republicans and vice versa. Democratic views of top threats are global and societal. So number 1 at 87% is COVID. Number 2 at 70 some percent is climate change, racial, social equality, foreign interference in elections. Those are the top 5 concerns of Democrats. Top 5 concerns of Republicans is China growing as a world power. Number 1 threat, 67%. International terrorism, the rise, the threat posed by Iran, and for Republicans longstanding, large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming across the border. So very different threats. And as a result, very different approaches. Democrats favor an approach that coordinates and cooperates with other countries, that works through international institutions. Republicans favor an approach that uses American power and leverage to get things done. So there is a very different, what we call an internationalist versus a nationalist approach to international politics, represented by these 2 powers, and frankly represented by Joe Biden and Donald Trump, which is why I think this is the most consequential election for American foreign policy since 1940.
Okay. How do you think those different worldviews will play out during these elections?
So foreign policy generally is not why people vote. So the fact that there are very stark differences is not going to explain one way or the other where this ends up. Reasons why people vote are character, are the economy, are how do you feel about the direction of the nation, but they tend to align. And so the Democratic view on foreign policy is not that different from the Democratic view on how to deal with the problems that we face, which is a cooperative perspective that assigns a bigger role to government, to working with the private sector and civil society to solve problems. On the Republican side, it is more a laissez-faire attitude on the economy, certainly on COVID and other issues. So the divide you see in foreign policy is a divide that's across the nation. And whether that divide turns out to be 55-45 or 52-48 or 49-51 is what this election is about.
Okay. Before we dive deeper into the substance, is there anybody in the audience who already has a question for Ivo after this first round? Nobody? Okay. Could you please mention your name and for the viewers?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Roer. Thanks for joining us, Ivo, from Chicago. One of the figures which strike me most from the report, as the pre-read provided by the organization, was about American exceptionalism. From 2012 to 2020, for the Republicans, quite stable, around 80%. And from the Democrats, decreasing over time, over those 8 years, from 2/3 to only 1/3. And my question is, from the view of the Democrats, who is currently the exceptionalists in the world?
So we didn't ask that, so I can't really answer that question. It's a very good question. I mean, clearly the decline in Democratic views is in part related to views of the current president. And so that if you have a very negative view of the man in the White House, as Democrats do, it becomes, and the fact that he is in the White House, it becomes more difficult to argue that the United States is the greatest nation on earth, which is our measure of exceptionalism, or is it no greater than any other country? I don't think that Democrats have a coherent view about what other nation is the greatest nation in the world. I don't think they look at it in that context, but they don't believe that the United States is truly exceptional in the way they did 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, and Republicans still do. So this is part of the identity issue, and as you have large demonstrations and deep concern about racial, social, and economic inequality, which are driving forces for much of what the Democratic public thinks, both domestically and in this poll, in terms of foreign policy, you get a different sense about how exceptional one is. So that's, I think, where the differences lie.
Okay. Ivo, could you tell us what, in your view, the conclusions are of 4 years of foreign policy of Donald Trump. Is damage being done to the world?
Well, as I wrote in a book with Jim Lindsay, The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership, a couple of years ago.
It's a good title, The Empty Throne.
It is, and then John Bolton started talking about the empty chair, and I said, well, it's not quite the same thing, right? It's not the same model, but empty it is, right? That's part of it. The lege troon, it's in Dutch too, so it's out there.
Yeah. Buy it.
You know, it's still for sale. I'm sure its Spectrum would like me to tell you that that's the case. Donald Trump is the first president who came to office since FDR, who did not believe that it was important for the United States to be leading in the world. The word leader and leading is not part of his vocabulary. For him, it's all about winning. Winning and leading are very, very different concepts. And we are seeing the consequences of that worldview, which takes a highly transactional relationship to how the United States deals with every country in the world, including, most importantly, US allies. So the decision on whether or not we put troops in a certain country and how much we want to engage with them on economic and other relationships is translated not into some overarching positive some value about security and prosperity and alliances, but in a zero-sum game of anything that's good for you is by definition bad for me and vice versa. And that is a relationship that you have with regard to NATO, to security alliances in Asia, to trade relationships with both our closest allies and our strongest adversaries. And as a result, you have an American approach typified as America first, but really about America alone. And this idea that we alone stand ready to defend our interests, that our interests are being attacked from everyone who's surrounding us, and that therefore we need to try to beat everybody who we engage in. As a result, the singular pillars of American foreign policy, strong security alliances, free markets and open trade, and support for freedom, democracy, and human rights, pillars that Democratic and Republican presidents since FDR have been the basis of American engagement in the world, all three are weakened, if not undermined. And the question is, how bad is that, the damage that has been done? The damage is severe. The damage is real. I don't have to tell you that. You're sitting in Amsterdam and you're looking at us here in the United States. But the Pew poll, which just came out on global survey about the favorability rating, not just of the President of the United States, who is now on average seen as being trusted by only 17% of the global public as somebody who you can trust to do the right thing in world affairs, but increasingly the United States too. And whereas in the Bush administration, there was a distinction between how people viewed America and how they viewed the leaders, that distinction is increasingly eroding, and the favorability views of the United States are being negatively affected. That translates into how do you rebuild alliance relationships and partnerships that, in my view, are critical for the United States to prosper and to be secure and free.
What do you notice in your daily life of this damage? What do you hear in your contacts worldwide? I know you work on a global scale. What do you hear?
So what I hear most is WTF is going on. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, as the Marines would say. What's wrong with you guys? How can you let this happen? And I think COVID sort of encapsulates this. We are 4% of the world's population. We have over 20% of the deaths and the cases. Yes, we test more than some other countries, but we miss about 9 in 10 possible cases. We have no government policy that is centralized to think about how we deal with this crisis. We have let this, the country that truly led public health. In fact, it was a ranking of who was best prepared to deal with a pandemic that came out in October of 2019, done by CSIS, put the United States #1, the Centers for Disease Control, the #1 public health agency in the world, and yet it utterly failed. And the question I get asked, how did that happen? How do you get somebody like Donald Trump as your president? How does that work? Where does that come from? So I think there's a deep sense of not comprehending of what is happening, and therefore a fear that America is different from what we thought it was.
Yeah. You mentioned the word alliances. You worked at NATO. You have a NATO heart. Are you worried about the membership of your country inside NATO? Are you worried that is there a risk that NATO, that the US will leave NATO? It's a question by Hugo van der Heijden, one of the young Atlanticists, and I would like to raise that question on behalf of him to you.
So yes, I am worried. If it was up to Donald Trump, the United States would not be a member of NATO, because he sees NATO as an organization that is completely paid for by the United States, in which others are free riding on our largesse and have, frankly, no benefit to America. So yes, I do think, and I just follow John Bolton, who was, after all, national security advisor for Donald Trump for 18 months, who has said publicly that if Donald Trump is reelected, the United States will leave NATO. That will be his intent. There is a but. There's an important but to this. The important but is that public support for NATO remains as high today as it's ever been. In fact, it's higher today than in the Cold War. About 67% of Americans think that NATO remains essential for U.S. security. Actually, 73% do. So that's a good number. The other is that on Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans, senators and representatives, are united and unanimous in their view that NATO remains essential. And they will do whatever they can to prevent the president from withdrawing from NATO. And in fact, they have already legislated a requirement that no money can be used to withdraw from NATO. That said, final but, any further indication that the United States has no interest in NATO, and given that Article 5 is itself not automatic, it doesn't say what it is that one does in order to defend an ally who has been attacked. If any continued evidence of distrust of NATO on the part of the President of the United States has a direct, immediate, negative impact on the security of all members of the alliance. And so even if the United States does not withdraw from NATO, the damage will have been done.
Okay. I would like to ask you a question on behalf of Ruud van Dijk, who wants to know what is the bigger threat to NATO? Russia's power, politics, China's assertiveness, or the growing political power of the illiberalism in many NATO member states?
So I don't want to rank them because they're all pretty significant challenges.
Tough, huh?
I think at its core, NATO is and has to be based on a set of common values. It is what ultimately, beyond a common threat, brings those countries together. I used to talk about NATO as being the house that NATO built, and the foundation of that house is a set of common values, a set of ideas about how people are governed, about what happens to the rule of law, to human rights, and indeed to democracy. And in that sense, the growing illiberalism, the growing threat to democracy, to those very common values, is eroding the foundation of the house that NATO built. Without a foundation, we will be like Jakarta, Mexico City, sinking into the ground. And so that is a major concern. It's also a major problem because NATO doesn't have mechanisms in a consensus-based organization for addressing those members who have succumbed to illiberalism, as some members indeed have. And how do you deal with a country like Hungary or Turkey, given that their ability to halt everything that happens in the organization, because it is an organization based on consensus, is something that the organization never had to face before, and from a legal perspective, finds difficult to handle, so therefore tends to ignore. But you can't ignore it. You can ignore it for some time, but you can't ignore it forever. Clearly, Russia is resurgent and is a revisionist power, and will use whatever opportunity, tactically or strategically, it has to find ways to divide the alliance, which ultimately is what its drive is about. And ultimately, where China goes and what the future of Chinese power is and how it relates to Europe, I think is the big question once we've dealt with those other two, of how do you deal with the foundational aspects of NATO and Russia.
Yeah. I want to have a look at the audience. Is there anybody here who has a follow-up question on NATO? I see another former NATO official, Maurits Jochems. You know him very well, I think, Ivo?
Hi, Maurits.
Hi, Ivo. And I really enjoyed our working together in my days in Kabul. I want to play a bit the role of the devil's, if not Trump's advocate, in what you said about foreign policy. Because I take your point that foreign policy is not probably the most important issue during the elections. But I had to admit to myself that the deal with the UAE and Bahrain, between Israel and those two countries, I'm not talking about the how, but the deal is there. There's maybe a deal upcoming in Afghanistan. China, or at least the Trump administration, is perhaps stronger on China, in his own words, than the previous administration. And last but not least, in NATO, where we were talking about, I think many of the European allies at least have come to the conclusion, maybe not enough, that they have to do more, and defense spending is going up. So in that sense, if it were to be an issue in the election debate in the United States, I could imagine that for the Trump administration, or for Trump, it's not so difficult to say, listen, I was more successful in foreign policy and the hard facts than the previous administration.
Thank you for this Republican sentiment. Ivo, what do you make of it?
I'm not what the previous administration and what it did, other than to say, I'd rather live with an agreement that constrains Iran's nuclear behavior than no agreement with Iran's nuclear behavior. So, but leave that aside. No doubt that just as a clock without a battery tells the right time twice a day, so it may indeed happen that in the course of 3.5 years, you can stumble in doing some things right when it comes to foreign policy. And the things you mention are important. And there's no doubt that the deal between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain is better than having no deal. We do have to understand, what is that deal? The deal was to normalize relations at some point. In return for what? A temporary halt to the annexation of the West Bank, which was promoted by the Trump administration. It was the Trump administration's idea to allow Israel to annex 30-some% of the West Bank as part of the brilliant peace plan that was going to resolve this conflict once and for all. But no doubt, better to have good relations between countries than no relations with countries, and to be encouraged. On Afghanistan, the deal that is on the table now, Maurits, you and I could have done too. If you say we're going to withdraw and you guys need to talk to each other, then we could have done that in 2011. In fact, we probably could have gotten a better deal. But this is a deal about the withdrawal of the United States and NATO. It's not a deal that brings peace to this part of the world, nor is it a deal that will ultimately solve the issue of terrorism in and of itself. So I don't see this. We may argue that that's a good outcome because it's time for us to leave Afghanistan. Let's have that debate. I don't think it is about the brilliance of American diplomacy. On China, the answer is yes. I do think that the administration has, over time, brought the issue of China to the fore in a way that none of its predecessors did. And clearly, the changing approach that China has had to both its internal economic development and dealing with the rest of the world that started with the elevation of Xi Jinping back in 2012, accelerated really late in the Obama administration, and then has continued through the Trump administration. I think we now have a bright spotlight on Chinese behavior in a way that we didn't before, that there was a presumption that China was a great big market, and the more we engaged with it, the better it was for everyone. Turns out that that engagement made China rich and powerful, which is a good thing for the people in China, but it also means that they've had opportunities to use that power now in ways that are not necessarily in our interest. And we're having this debate now. And I think China as an issue, the administration has highlighted. We then should talk about how it has dealt with China and how effective it has been with China, and how on the trade issues, on the technology issues, on the defense issues. And there I'd say that the one thing we have that China doesn't is allies. We have allies. It's the one big advantage the United States has over any other great power in the world. And what have we done? We have divided the allies when it comes to China and so much else. We haven't put them together in a joint strategy on trade and IP protection or technology defense. We have certainly not put them together in order to deal with the security challenges that we face in that part of the world. In fact, we are more interested in getting the South Koreans to give us $5 billion for basing rights in Korea than we're trying to figure out how to get Japan and South Korea, India, Australia, and our European friends to figure out how to deal with a rising China. So, yes, just like that clock that will be right twice a day, because when it stands still, the Trump administration has done things that are useful from a foreign policy perspective. On balance, are we more secure? Are we more free and more prosperous as a result of the Trump administration, or less? That's a question up for the American voters on November 3rd. I don't think you will be surprised to know where I stand on that.
Ivo, when I listen to you, I haven't heard the word yet, famous entity, European Union. Where is Europe in your story?
Well, Europe is part, in my view, is part of our allies and friends and partners. Just as the president has looked at NATO as a transactional relationship, he has made it very clear, and he deeply believes in his bones, that the European Union is an economic foe, a word he has used, of the United States. In fact, he constantly says that they are worse than China, that the European Union was formed to beat the United States in economic relations. I mean, by the way, a view that is held within big parts of his administration at top levels, including the Secretary of State, who went to Brussels and made that case 2 years ago in an infamous speech by Mike Pompeo. So it's part of that transactional view.
My question is, in fact, what do you think that Europe should do about this? Listen to it, continue, or counter it?
I think Europe needs to, what happens on November 3rd. And I think Europe has, for good reasons, tried to figure out, is there a way to work with Donald Trump? The 70-plus-year-old relationship that Europe has had with the United States is not something you throw under the bus. It is something that you try to work with. You try to use whatever power you have to influence American policy, and on the issues of trade, which is probably the issue in which Europe has most power, it has been able to do so. And it is increasingly coming forward and saying maybe we can no longer rely on the United States and maybe we need to figure out how to do this ourselves. Now, Europe has had some problems. Yeah. Brexit has been a big issue that has diminished European overall power. The UK is an important country. And to the extent it is no longer part of the EU, it weakens the overall EU. It has had leadership challenges internally. It has some strong leaders who have been there for a long time, including the German Chancellor and I'd say the Dutch Prime Minister and some others who are trying to figure out how to use the power of Europe in a constructive way. But doing so in a way that doesn't necessarily deviate too far from the United States. Yes, on trade. Yes, now on vaccine development, COVID strategies, WHO funding, and I think increasingly, yes, understanding that the United States is the only problem in the world. There's China, there's Russia, and we as Europeans need to find ways to our capability. Not as effective as I'd want to, probably not as effective as you want to, but better than nothing.
There's a lot of talking about strategic autonomy of Europe. Do you believe in that?
I don't have to believe in it. The question is, does Europe believe in it? Yeah. I think strategic autonomy makes no sense unless the other side wants to be autonomous too. So if you have a United States that is no longer interested in being part of the transatlantic relationship, that looks at the EU as a foe and NATO as a drain on resources, then strategic autonomy becomes not just an alternative, but the only practical way forward.
But do you think that the current Union is capable of developing that strategic autonomy?
I wouldn't put a lot of money on it, but I think there is a...
That's an honest answer. Yeah.
But I do think that as the strategic situation changes,
yeah. But why wouldn't you put your money on that? What needs to be done to get you to show us your money?
Well, because there's two tensions that are going on, and they have to be resolved to determine whether you will go into to make the political decisions necessary to move forward on strategic autonomy. One is, what is the relationship with the United States? And the debate about whether strategic autonomy strengthens or weakens the transatlantic relationship is a real debate in Europe. By the way, it's a real debate in the United States. My view, anything that makes Europe stronger is good for the United States and good for the transatlantic relationship. So I'm very much on that other side. But there are lots of people who look at this as a zero-sum game. I don't. I think there's positive sum. But that's number one. And number two is the alternative to strategic unity is national self-sufficiency. And maybe strategic unity is important in order to advance large strategic interests with regard to the big powers, whether it's Russia, China, or the United States. But many countries may decide we don't want to play that game. We're fine off just spending our time thinking about what's happening in our own little country and dealing with our own little problems. And indeed, if you look at the initial response to the COVID crisis, that was the answer. Let's go back in our own little shells and put up bigger walls around the world. So those are the two other forces. What is the relationship of the United States, and what's the relative balance between European cooperation and national politics? And if I have to put money on it, I think the relationship of the United States is sufficiently uncertain to make the push for strategic autonomy less likely. And I think the strength of national thinking is going up rather than down, which also makes it less likely that there is going to be strategic unity on the European level.
Is there anybody in the audience who wants to follow up this part of our conversation? Because I would like to close the pessimistic part and then go to the optimistic part. Could you please mention your name and your affiliation, please?
First of all, thank you. I'm Thijs Visser. I'm with the Studium Generale. I was wondering, with the controversy about the mail-in ballots and the announcement by Trump that he probably won't accept the result if he is not elected, how should Europe respond to a contested election in the United States?
Well, let's hope there's no contested election to start with. I think that would be, that's for Europe to decide on how it should respond. The United States is a member of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. There will be OSCE election observers in the United States, no doubt. There are large European embassies who will be informing their own governments about the state of the relationship. But I'll leave the question of what Europe should do in that case to the Europeans rather than making news about what I think should happen. Let's just hope that the election is really straightforward. People vote, their votes get counted, they add them all up, and the one who has the most votes wins.
Okay, Ivo, you have painted a rather bleak picture of U.S. leadership in the last 4 years. Let's now turn to the optimistic part. Joe Biden will be elected, and will he change the world then, in your view?
The world has changed. So the world that Joe Biden will find if he is elected, and it's an if, it's certainly not a certainty, on the 20th of January 2021, is not the same world that he left when he was vice president on January 2017. It's a very different world. It's a world that starts off with these 5 crises that I have talked about, all of which have gotten worse, some of which didn't exist. COVID didn't exist. The economic crisis didn't exist. The racial crisis did exist, but its high salience, political and otherwise, in the United States, and indeed in other parts of the world, including in the Netherlands, is much higher today than it was 4 years ago. The climate crisis is much worse, although it certainly existed in 2017. And the democracy crisis, which also existed in 2017, is now worse too. So that world is different. That's number one. Number two is the relationship of the United States with its partners has changed. We've just talked about for 45 minutes how that has changed. And when trust and confidence are broken in interpersonal relationships, say in marriage, rebuilding trust and confidence is hard. It's not easy, it's not automatic. And that is true when it happens between nations. I'm deeply concerned about the view in European publics or our Asian allied publics of the United States, not just of our leaders change, but of the United States. The favorability rating of the United States among our partners is less than 34%. That's stunning.
What can Joe Biden do about that? How can he restore relations, create goodwill again?
I mean, the first thing he needs to do is he has to address these crises. And he has to start having a crisis that says, let's demonstrate that America is competent in dealing with a pandemic, which is his number one issue. And until that pandemic is under control, we're not going to be able to restart the economy in the way it needs to be restarted. And until we restart the economy, we're not going to be able to deal with some of the other big issues, including the social, economic, and racial inequalities that exist in the United States, dealing with climate change and the other issues. So he has to deal with the crisis at hand. Secondly, I think he needs to understand that the way the United States has led for the past 70 or so years has to change. It has to evolve. It has to become much more shared and much more partnership. The United States needs to look at who are our biggest and most important friends in the world. And there's a group of them. They're the major European powers plus the European Union. There's South Korea, Australia, and Japan. There's Canada. That makes 10 plus the United States. And the U.S. should and think about how do we tackle the global challenges that we have, including COVID, including the economic crisis, including the democracy crisis, including China, including Russia. How do we do that in concert with our friends? And I think what the kind of leadership that you need to find from the United States is one that says, We need to think about how we come to common solutions on common challenges, and we should do so by redistributing responsibilities and burdens within our alliance structure, not as an alternative to the difference. And I didn't answer Maurits's question on NATO defense spending. For Trump, increasing NATO defense spending is about reducing American spending. That reduces the overall security and strength of the alliance. For his predecessors, and I think for Joe Biden, increasing NATO spending, which is something, by the way, American presidents have tried to do since Harry Truman was president, so it's not like a new thing, is about building up the collective capacity of the entire enterprise. And thinking through how we redistribute responsibilities and burdens, and why strategic autonomy, or the strengthening European ability to act, is important, is because we want more people to do more. We want, for example, Europe to think about the Asia-Pacific region, not just in economic terms, but in geopolitical terms as well. And indeed, what's happening is a country like Germany, of all places, now has an Indo-Pacific strategy. It has a strategy thinking through how does German power and capability affect what happens in Asia. That's a good thing. And you want leadership that brings that about, to say, we are jointly responsible for resolving these issues, not something that we do as a favor to you, or where we are competing for that aspect. But it can't just be transatlantic, it can't just be trans-Pacific, it really has to bring all of them together.
Okay, let's assume that Joe Biden gets elected, and he, on day one, he decides to appoint Ivo Daalder as his top global envoy to restore relations. What would you do to restore international relations in the short term?
So I would go to the most important friends and allies.
Those 10.
Those 10.
That's not very much in a big world, Ivo. 10.
10, but they represent 60% of global military power and over 50% of global GDP. So it's
okay, but we have 193 UN member states. So,
and
what about the rest?
You would want to work with them too. But in order for the 193 to work, the 10 have to work together. If they don't work together, the 93 don't work. So it's the process. So you need to get together and start off with the most important thing. We need a strategy for COVID. We need a joint strategy that understands that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And we need to have a vaccination strategy, a vaccination distribution strategy, kind of an investment in making sure that it's not just us rich people who get vaccinated, but that the vaccine, if presuming it works, is distributed around the country. The damage of COVID is not just in the numbers of cases and deaths. The damage, long-term damage in COVID, particularly in the developing world, is the economic and health consequences that come because of COVID. We have the largest hunger crisis in the world today since World War II. And if these 10 large countries don't work together and have a common strategy, you won't be able to get the UN or China or anybody else to be part of it. So I do think it is about finding new ways of collaboration. But you have to work on COVID. You have to work on China. You have to work on climate change. You have to work on the trading regime, which needs to be updated and reformed. But it's about working together to reform international behavior in international institutions as a means towards bettering the world writ large. It's that kind of leadership that the United States presented to the world for 75 years. It needs to be changed and transformed, but you still need to have the catalyst of the United States. I still believe, and I may be wrong, in which case, if we are in the scenario you paint, we will all fail. But I believe there is a huge demand for someone to help lead all of us. The fact that we have the largest economic and health crisis in 50 years, in 100 years, and the G7 doesn't meet, and the G20 doesn't meet, and the UN Security Council doesn't meet, tells me there's something wrong in the international system. And if the United States isn't willing to lead that international system, no one else, frankly, is going to do it for.
Okay, is there anybody in the audience who wants to follow up on what Joe Biden needs to do to make this world a better place?
Hello, my name is Hugo van der Heijden. I'm a sort of a former board member of the Young Atlantici, the Dutch Atlantic Youth. You talk about restoring the relationship between Europe and the United States, and I was wondering where in that you see restoring some events that have took place. For example, around Nord Stream 2, the actions that the United States as a country took there to show Germany that they should stop, and how to restore trade barriers that have been created, and how long do you expect that would take, and what are the implications for those events?
So, on the specifics of Nord Stream 2, I don't think the Biden administration is going to take a different view on the strategic folly of having Nord Stream 2 completed. In fact, the Obama administration was strongly against Nord Stream 2, and it is a strategic folly. And I hope that the debate today in Germany on the future of Nord Stream 2 ends up where it ought to end up, which is to halt and cancel the program. The question, though, goes to what kind of measures the United States has taken, the extraterritorial imposition of sanctions on its allies, which it's also doing with regard to Iran, of course. And I think there will be, not an immediate, but a gradual change in approach, but it will be part of a larger discussion. I don't think that Joe Biden is walking in and the first executive order that he's going to pull out is saying we're going to have no more tariffs and we're going to have no more sanctions. I think what is going to happen is there's a degree of leverage here that has been created to sit down and say, how are we going to resolve these issues and what are we going to do about Nord Stream 2? And how can we figure out a way to reduce the vulnerability that is being created through the creation of Nord Stream 2. On trade issues, I think we have big differences between the United States and Europe on trade. I do think we will try and find a way to not only restart the process of arbitration in the WTO by appointing new judges, but also to work together with Europe on reforming the WTO as part of that process. But this is not about walking in and saying, let's forget about the last 4 years. Let's go back to a situation that existed before, and we're just going to erase everything. And that includes on Iran. I don't see the administration walking in and says, let's just say the JCPOA is back in force. For one thing, the Iranians are no longer complying with the JCPOA. And we can look at whose fault it is, but you need a diplomatic process that gets us from where we are today, stuck, and not moving forward on trade, on Nord Stream 2, on Iran, and what have you. And that diplomatic process will have to include the reality that there are certain sanctions and certain tariffs that exist today. And how you move them away is part of that diplomatic process.
There's a lot of talk about a new Cold War between the US and China. How do you think Biden will handle China?
So I think Biden, consistent with most in the United States, has changed his view about what the Chinese goals are. And I think there's a sea change in the United States. We also find that in our own opinion poll, not as stark as the sea change in Washington, but there's a sea change. There's a basic appreciation that the goals of the Chinese are no longer aligned necessarily with the goals of the United States, on the economic side, on the military side, and on the political side. And that we are, in each of those three areas, in an era in which we are competing. The real question is, how do you compete? Do you compete in order to do it in a zero-sum kind of way, which says that any gain for the other side is bad for us, which is what the current administration is doing? Or do you compete in order to create a world in which we can both achieve more of what each of us wants without necessarily doing it in a negative-sum way? So there's certain areas, I'd say pandemics being one, climate change being others, that it makes no sense to compete in a zero-sum way. I would argue the same is true for economics. The deep integration of our economies makes it impossible to think about our economic relationship as how Trump looks at it, which is you win, I lose, I win, you lose. It is how do you get to win-win? But win-win that's fair. And let's be clear, the Chinese don't play fair. They haven't. They don't play by the rules, and so we need to figure out ways to strengthen our capacity to get the Chinese to play with the rules. One way to do that is to have the European and Asian allies and our North American partners part of a process to pressure China, rather than us pressuring everybody, and as a result, the Chinese getting away with what they're getting away with. So. It'll be a more sophisticated, but still deeply competitive kind of relationship, particularly in areas of national security and technology and economics.
I think we have time for one last foreign policy questions before I will ask you for a prognosis on the outcome. Think about that. I see Arnoud Brouwers. Can we have a microphone over there, please?
Yes. Hi, Ivo. This is Arnoud Brouwers from the Volkskrant. I have a question about decoupling between the US and Europe. So there's a lot of speculation about it, but you could also say that to a large extent it's already happened. If you look at some of the issues that the Europeans are dealing with now, Turkey, Russia, there are many questions on our plate which really don't involve directly the United States. At least, of course, the US is involved, but not in an active role. We had an interesting opinion poll come out this week by Klingendahl, in which 60% of 23,000 Dutch people said that in a new Cold War between the US and China, they want to stay aloof. They do not want to be part of this new Cold War. This is also, I think, very much the public sentiment. If you read columnists, if you read advice to the government, it's all about keeping distance and making up your mind autonomously. And this is coming from the Netherlands, so this is certainly not different in other European countries. So, like you said, the situation has already changed quite dramatically. How do you feel that a new Biden administration could deal with that, and how could Europeans also be faced with questions from the Biden administration which they don't expect, perhaps, or which perhaps they're not ready to face this new wave of cooperation coming from Washington?
So, Arno, I think you articulated better my fear, which is that the relationship is not only in a bad state, but in one where restoring it to a new state and a more cooperative state is going to be extraordinarily difficult. I often quote, and I'll start quoting the Klingendahl poll because it may be better, but I often quote the Singaporean prime minister, whose advice to the United States is, don't ask us to choose between China and the United States because you may not like the answer. And I think one of the reasons that this zero-sum Cold War perspective on the U.S.-China relationship is so dangerous, because so many of our friends, real and former and prospective, may decide in a way that we don't, in this competition, that we don't like. So that is why it is so important to assert in the strongest possible way the importance and the understanding that we won't be able to deal with the problems that we face, whether it's Russia or Turkey or COVID or climate or the economic challenge that China now represents, unless we do it together, that we rekindle this spirit of working together. And if we fail in the part of the United States, and by the way, if we fail in the part of Europe and our Asian partners in doing so, we will all be worse off. It's not like we're going to be better off that it is when the United States is absent. One of the reasons we're having the problems we're having is because the United States is not there. Now, we don't want an overbearing United States. We don't want one that, I think it was a UN ambassador to the US ambassador to the UN today was quoted as saying, we're better off making peace alone. Well, I don't know how you make peace alone. In relation to Iran, I mean, we need to be working together again. And there's one thing I know about Joe Biden. This is in it. This is in his soul. This is who he is. He fundamentally believes in the idea that there are good guys who need to get together, who share a set of values, and need to work together. It will be, and I'll end there. This is the last time. If we're not going to succeed here, we're not going to succeed down the line. And it is also why this election, as I said, is the most important election since 1940. Because if Donald Trump gets reelected, then I don't think you do have that opportunity anymore. I don't think you're going to find the world uniting behind Donald Trump's view of international relations.
Who will win the election?
Either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I think that's now clear. Opinion polls are suggest it would be Joe Biden. He is ahead anywhere between 6 and 8 points. Most importantly, in virtually every opinion poll, he's at 50% or above. Last I looked, if you have 50%, you win. If you compare to 2016, which a lot of people do, his position in the opinion polls, which are better, hopefully better than last time around, certainly the lessons we've learned about what went wrong in 2016, suggests that he's in a better position than Hillary Clinton was. But being in a better position than Hillary Clinton doesn't mean you win. Strange things happen. The death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the fight we will have about the Supreme Court is a monkey wrench that can change the dynamic of this election. Who knows what Russia still has up its sleeve? Who knows what incumbency allows the president to do? We still have 6 weeks. Lots of things can change. But if the election were today, I'm pretty confident that Biden wins. But the election, unfortunately, is on November 3rd.
Okay. Is there anybody in the audience who wants to follow up on this, in the elections? Where will you be after the elections, Ivo?
Let's talk election.
Sorry?
Let's talk after the election.
But are you? Yeah. No. Are you open for an entry back in the administration?
You learn never to say never if Donald Trump calls, the answer is no. Why?
You are an American. You are a patriot. So I think he could use your advice.
Yeah, he won't. So I think we have a record of people who have tried to go inside, and he will surround himself with people who will want to do what he wants to do. And I think that's, I do believe, as I said, this election matters. And as a result, depending on the outcome, if I can be of service and assistance and make it matter, I certainly consider it.
Okay. I think we have come to an end. And I would like to thank you for your wonderful insights and for injecting us with a sense of urgency that these elections are also very important for us, for Europe, to have a sort of reintroduction of leadership, as you mentioned it. And I hope we are still an old friend and an old ally, and that we can continue, and that perhaps the last 4 years have been a kind of intermezzo. maybe we see you back again in a new position, in a high-ranking position in the new administration. And I would like to have the audience to give you a round of applause for your... I have no famous last words other than, Ivo, I hope to see you back again, whether either at the Council or in the Biden administration. Take care, stay safe, and see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks to the Atlantic Commission for allowing me to be with you from Chicago. One of the great things about COVID is we can actually have a lot of meetings, and it only takes an hour of your time. You don't even have to get on an airplane anymore. So I appreciate the opportunity to share the afternoon, my morning, with you.
Thank you, Ivo. And I would also like to thank the audience for being active online or here at the Balie. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.